Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Wendy Sanhai, and I'll be your moderator for today's session. As we know, presidential transitions often bring a wave of changes across federal agencies, and FDA is no exception. Today, we're only going to focus on FDA, not the other agencies under the Department of Health and Human Services. And as a refresher, FDA's mission is to protect and promote public health. In addition to that, FDA is also responsible for helping to accelerate medical innovations, provide science-based health information, and contribute to counterterrorism efforts related to food security and medical product development. The agency acts as a consumer protection entity focused on safeguarding the public health, and it regulates human and veterinary drugs, biologics, medical devices, and radiation-emitting products, the nation's food supply, cosmetics, dietary supplements, and tobacco products. Altogether, FDA's remit impacts about 25% of the US GDP, totaling about $2.6 million of products consumed by US citizens. With the recent executive orders, there have been significant changes in internal processes, procedures, policies, and priorities at FDA, and we're going to cover the 4 Ps today. These changes will impact how or whether the agency can fulfill its public health mission. And today we'll delve into how FDA is navigating and responding to recent executive orders and other changes to its internal operations. We will also share insights on how regulated entities might navigate an increasingly complex regulatory landscape. And to do that, we've brought together a panel of regulatory and policy experts to help us unpack what's happened so far and how we can best prepare and respond to changes in the months ahead. Specifically, we'll explore the ripple effects of leadership changes within the agency, discuss evolving priorities, and examine how internal resource constraints could impact PDUFA timelines, reviews, and inspections, and the potential impact on the American public, all of whom use and benefit from products under FDA's jurisdiction. And we'll offer practical takeaways for how companies and regulated entities can stay agile in this evolving environment. But before we get started, a few quick housekeeping notes. This session is being recorded, and we will make the recording available on Eloquent's website in about a week or so. Please use the question and answer box to submit questions, and we will be leaving time at the end for those. So now, let's get started. As I mentioned, my name is Wendy Sanhai, and I'll be today's moderator. I am privileged to be a member of the board of directors here at Eloquent Life Sciences, and I actually started my career in public health at the Department of Health and Human Services, first at NIH in 2001, and then moved to the Center for Devices and Radiological Health at FDA. In 2004, I became the senior scientific advisor in the immediate office of the commissioner, a role I held until 2011 when I left the agency to join GlaxoSmithKline. In 2016, I joined Deloitte, where I continued to serve clients across the life sciences and healthcare industry. And last October, I transitioned to academia, where I now serve as a professor of practice and executive in residence at the University of Maryland School of Business. I'm joined today by a panel of experts, John Taylor, Kayla Auchincloss, and Brian Mayhew, all of whom served in various leadership roles at the FDA and within industry. And I'm going to ask each panel member to introduce himself and herself, and we'll start with you, John.
Thank you, Wendy, for that kind introduction. My name is John Taylor. I oversee Eloquent's quality and compliance practice. I've been in the FDA space for over 30 years. I started my career at FDA in 1991 in the Office of Chief Counsel. I'm a lawyer by profession. I was Associate Chief Counsel for Enforcement, and I worked on civil and criminal enforcement actions and other litigation matters. During that same period, I also was on detail at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Baltimore, working on the Generic Drug Task Force. After spending time, about 6 years, practicing law, I then transitioned to the Commissioner's Office, and I was Senior Advisor Commissioner for several years. From there, I transitioned to the Center for Drugs, and I was Director of the Office of Compliance. From there, I became FDA's Director of Office of Enforcement, and then later, not long after 9/11, I became the Associate Commissioner for Regulatory Affairs. I performed that job for several years, and then I left the agency to go to Abbott, where I served as the Vice President of Federal Government Affairs. In that role, I worked on obviously government affairs functions, but also legal, regulatory, and quality issues. And then from there, I went to Bio and I served as the Executive Vice President for Health. I oversaw Bio's health section and also worked on food matters. And then in 2009, I returned to the agency. I'd known Dr. Hamburg from a previous life. In 2009, I left Bio to go to the agency to serve as her counselor to the commissioner. I spent 5 years at FDA, and also during that time, I served as principal deputy commissioner and then deputy commissioner for global operation and policy. After leaving FDA, I came to Greenleaf and I became the president, and I served in that role until transitioning to Eloquent. Thank you. And with that, I'm going to let Kayla Auchincloss, my friend and colleague, introduce herself.
Thanks, John. My name is Kayla Auchincloss. I'm a principal here at Eloquent on the quality and compliance team with John. I've been here since 2017, and I came to Eloquent, which was then Greenleaf, from the agency, from FDA. I served in a number of different roles at FDA over the course of about 6 years. I was the deputy chief of staff to Commissioner Califf when he was commissioner the first time around. Before that, I was on the Hill as an FDA detailee to the Health Committee when the 21st Century Cures Act was being negotiated. And before that, I was in CDER in a couple of different roles. I was leading one of the CDER offices of compliance, the Office of Unapproved Drugs and Labeling Compliance at that time, which had unapproved drugs, OTC drugs, compounding, and some of the other misfit products. And I was also started out in CDER's Office of Regulatory Policy, handling policy-related issues, citizen petitions, and regs and guidances. And I joined FDA after having served at a law firm as an associate for several years. Like John, I'm a lawyer by training. Over to you.
All right, thanks. Good morning. My name is Brian Mayhew. I lead Eloquent's regulatory policy and intelligence function. I started in November of 2024. I actually began my career in the first Office of Tobacco Programs at the FDA some 20 years ago or so, and then subsequently moved into the Commissioner's Office of Policy. And I've spent the bulk of my career in the biopharmaceutical industry, always in the regulatory policy and intelligence space. So,
Wow, that's all I can say. Thank you all so much for being here. So let's jump to our first topic of the day and not waste any time. And the first topic is agency resources. And I'll start by turning it over to you, Kayla. I know you bring deep experience from your time at the FDA and also working closely with regulated companies. So what are you seeing when it comes to the agency's current resource landscape?
Sure, that's a great question, and definitely one of the big topics that are top of mind for industry and others alike these days. So I'm going to touch on a couple of different things high level, and then I think we'll get into more detail as we talk through the panel going forward. So there have clearly been a number of significant changes at the agency since January 20th. We've all been alive watching what's been going on, so we are aware of them. Of course, there have been RIFs, the reductions in force, which included not only sort of line level staff, mostly policy and communication staff, but also longtime agency leadership, really across the board, centers in the commissioner's office and at various other locations. So there's really been a significant loss of brain trust and a loss of personnel at the agency over the last 4 or 5 months, which is disappointing. That's also coupled with the hiring freeze and a regulatory freeze. The hiring freeze, as far as I know, is still in place. I think Brian's going to talk a little bit about that, but essentially for every 4 employees that leave the agency, only 1 can be replaced, 1 rehired. So that makes it a little difficult to attract talent and to bring in needed resources. There's also been a deregulatory initiative. Again, we'll get into more details about this a little bit later, but there's a rule that requires that for every new policy, and policy is really defined broadly here, it's not just a regulation, it's also a guidance. So for every new policy, 10 have to be eliminated. And that's a pretty steep hurdle to overcome to issue new policy documents. HHS issued a call a couple weeks ago to identify rules and policies that should be eliminated. That's sort of part of this process for their deregulatory agenda and figuring out what can be taken off the books to achieve some of their newer policy goals that Brian will also talk about. And then there have been a couple of executive orders and presidential memos, again, trying to implement this this deregulatory initiative, including one that talks about sort of de facto anything that is inconsistent with a number of Supreme Court cases, including a case called Loper Bright that was decided last year, are sort of de facto illegal and should be eliminated. So that's resources from that perspective. There's also some budget cuts. Commissioner McCary testified a couple of weeks ago before Congress about the president's FY26 budget. It includes an 11.5% reduction in budget authority compared to FY25. So that's a pretty significant cut to the agency, particularly in light of some of the recent policy initiatives and other things that the commissioner would like to achieve. So that's a restraint on resources for sure. It does include and contemplate user fees, which I think is a positive thing, but certainly some budgetary restraints. So I think all of this leads to the idea that there's clearly been some big changes at the agency. There are some morale issues at FDA, talking to former colleagues, advising clients and interacting with the agency in more formal and official settings. I think the agency really has changed, and there's morale concerns. The absence of colleagues, the job and the mission uncertainty is really having an impact on folks. There have also been several missed PDUFA dates, as many of us have seen in the trade press, two pretty high profile ones that occurred relatively recently. And we anecdotally heard of some of our clients who have had missed meetings or delayed and rescheduled meetings with the agency. I think there have certainly been some impact as a result of these budget cuts. But at the same time, I do think there's some positive news and some good things to think about. Inspections are happening. John and I do a lot of quality and compliance work, as we noted, and our clients are preparing for inspections. We have seen inspections happen. They are classifying inspections. So those are still ongoing. It's not unheard of for FDA to miss PDUFA dates. So even though there have been two relatively high profile ones that were missed recently, the goal in the letters is 90%. So 10% can be missed, and that does happen. I think there were 6 that were missed in FY23, just as a comparison. So having missed 2 now is not, the sky may not be falling. And although I talked about clients who have had meetings delayed or canceled, there are meetings that are happening. We had a client who had a meeting rescheduled, and then had a very productive interaction with the agency during that meeting. So, the staff at the agency, despite some of their morale concerns, are really trying to do their job day to day. They engaged very effectively with this client. They were very prepared. So that was a very positive interaction. There's new leadership being put in place. We've seen, DeCary be confirmed, RFK be confirmed. There's a new CTP head. There's a new head of OII, which used to be ORA. So there are leadership folks that are being put in place, which I think will offer some level of stability to staff at the agency. And as I mentioned before, there is going to be an UFA cycle. I think that, it may change. We may not know exactly what it's going to look like, but it is clearly contemplated in the budget, and there will be negotiations that happen, and there will be user fees to fund part of the agency going forward. That will continue. And then, I think the final thought is that there was talk of a reorg, a pretty significant reorganization of the agency, but that's been taken off the table. Which I think also provided some level of comfort to FDA and to the sort of line level staff. There may be some changes that come along with that. They may consolidate what they're calling shared functions, and things like IT and HR, but there isn't going to be this massive consolidation of review functions and compliance functions that I think was originally contemplated. So I think the top line message here, having just dumped a lot of that information on everybody, is that although there have really been some significant and in some cases even unwelcome changes in the last 5 months, there is some hope. The agency today is definitely not the same as it was on January 20th or before January 20th. And it probably will not be the same tomorrow as it is today. There are changes that are coming, but there are signs that we're returning to at least a functional, more stable, regulated body in a way that we're more used to.
Well, thanks so much, Kayla, for that sobering list of facts. It's always a great overview. Thank you so much. And to build on that, I'd like to really turn it over now to the panel. From your vantage point, how are resource constraints manifesting in what you're seeing in your day-to-day activities and interactions, not just with the agency, but also with clients, whether it's in the form of longer review timelines, limited engagement, or shifts in inspection activity? So maybe we'll start with you first, John, and then we'll move to Brian.
Sure. So just to follow on a couple things that Kayla said, indeed, we have had some situations where we have had our clients' meetings delayed. The initial response has been disappointment, but we've told them that's better than a cancellation. And indeed, those meetings have all gone well. But there's a couple lessons learned to glean from those meetings. One is, I think in several of the instances, what actually happened is that some people had left the agency due to attrition. And so the agency, if you will, had to reconstitute the team that was dealing with the issues before us. And that meant two things. One is there was sort of a burden on us and our client to provide information that maybe the new folks didn't know because of their lack of institutional knowledge, or the fact that they were just being recently exposed to the fact pattern. So that was a different role, but a positive role when it comes to interaction with the agency. There are things you can do to help the agency help you in terms of filling information, substantive and other gaps that result from what is real attrition that's occurring. I think the other positive is that we are seeing some level of stabilization. Is it where it was? No, but let me give you another tangible example in the space that Kayla and I occupy. Warning letters for a long time were not being posted. 483s were not being posted. And the reason is because the Freedom of Information staff was let go, and therefore there weren't the same number of people available to redact those documents for posting. It's hard to tell with certainty what's going on, but their reported news is that the FOIA staff has been rehired, and if you subscribe to the FDA services, you'll see that warning letters are once again in the last couple of weeks being posted. So as Kayla said, there are some areas of stabilization, but as we going to discuss throughout the rest of this discussion, there is definitely change, and the key here is how do you change your longstanding practice in light of that change.
And it's a good point, I think, about the more transparency coming back to FDA. For a period of time, there was a communications freeze. I think that's been lifted, and you're seeing more, not only warning letters being posted, but public communications from the FDA coming back more akin to what we're used to, which is, I think, another positive. And some rehiring of staff that were let go.
Yeah, that's really good news.
Good news.
Yeah, I think to stay on the positive note, we're still seeing, in the development and regulatory approval timeline, we're still seeing milestone meetings taking place and certainly helping clients there. I think it's also some of the little things that go unnoticed or maybe underappreciated, where it's, hey, I used to rely on so-and-so, and can you help me navigate now who to speak with, and what group is still there? And so we can certainly help them as well in that context. And I think just maybe taking a step out, and you've mentioned more broadly, but I think that's going to be an interesting place. You mentioned new FDA leadership. This is really, the upcoming negotiations are really a place where the new leadership can potentially set out their, the FDA budget, performance, and related issues for the next period of time. And we're talking about, these negotiations taking place in the next period of months and over the next year or so, but then also those being in place, these user fee agreements for the next several years. And so this really provides a new FDA leadership that really responsibility with that opportunity to really set the tone for the FDA over the next several years.
Thanks so much. Such insight. And so at this point, and in the interest of time, we're going to move on to the next topic. And with that, I know that while resources shape capacity, policy helps define the agency's direction. And so with that in mind, I'd like to turn us to the second topic for today, and that is FDA policy priorities, to help us understand where FDA is heading from a strategic and a regulatory standpoint. I'm going to turn it over to you first, Brian.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. And so I think maybe a good way to start this and maybe set the table is to go back to January. So Kayla's mentioned a few of these items already, but maybe just to focus in a little bit. So we started with a regulatory and a hiring freeze, which I think most people expect in a new administration. These are very typical actions that they use first coming into office. And so I think with that expectation in place, we then saw really a flurry of activities around executive orders, memos, and in related activities that really, I think, has now set the tone for this notion of a really a deregulation period of time. And so whether that stays within this 1 year and then we see some relinquishing of this, we'll sort of forecast that a little bit. But I think for the time being, we've really seen them focus on this notion of the 10-for-1 ratio, which, as Kayla said, has been, I think, quite onerous in a lot of ways when you're talking about a regulatory authority like the FDA. It really does hamper their ability to be effective in a lot of ways, but really do some of their routine day-to-day work. I think with that in mind, that notion of deregulation, I'll maybe go a level or two deeper. So we're talking about right now, we're really in the midst and coming up on a key milestone for those related deregulation initiatives where federal agencies across the board have been tasked with identifying either unlawful regulations that would go against recent court decisions, as well as anti-competitive. And so with this semblance of a time frame where, let's say in the late summer, we'll have some notion of where federal agencies stand in that respect. But this really could clear the path then later this fall and certainly into 2026, where the administration would be able to put their regulatory policy foot forward in a more meaningful way, and I'd say a more tangible way than what we've seen so far. I also want to touch on, so there's one of the other key aspects that was introduced through executive orders. One was DOGE, which I think was very new for everyone. And they have a significant mandate with respect to fraud, waste, and abuse. And I think when you marry that with this notion of deregulation, you really see the overall this sort of broad notion of the administration really trying to, at least in this time frame, slow down and in some ways stop regulation. Also another kind of new take on formerly what we would call a task force or a commission by a president. We have the MAHA initiative. So this is the Make America Healthy initiative where, again, not unlike what we've seen in the past where commissions are put in place or task forces, but it really calls on a broad swath of the federal agencies to work together on a set of priorities or topics. And so in this instance, MAHA is really focused on chronic diseases and specifically in pediatric patients. And so in the initial report, it really brings together the initial MAHA report, that is, it brings together some interesting data. It's much broader than just biopharma. It's foods, it's diet, it's vaccines, certainly. And so in that context, it is an attempt to be comprehensive in addressing pediatric chronic disease. But I think in terms of the 10 recommendations that it includes, these aren't necessarily new ideas. We see AI, we see real world evidence, we see this notion of more robust post-market surveillance. So again, I think it does start to sort of forecast where you'll see this new FDA operating in a certain context. So
Thanks so much, Brian. And just to be sure, the 10-to-1 deregulation attempt is not just on rules, but also guidances, which we know that regulated industry depend on because these are recommendations from the agency that really helps guide them on their everyday processes. So it could be significant. So I want to open it up to the panel. Also, how are these influencing, at least what you see, how companies are planning for their submissions, the interactions with the agencies, and just adjusting their regulatory strategy? So Brian, since you finished up, you want to continue from there, and then we'll turn it over to John and Kayla.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you. I think maybe, and to maybe again take a step back, is how the Trump 2.0 has really, I think, operated in an initial capacity versus what maybe to avoid some pitfalls that they saw in the Trump 1.0, where I think we clearly in the first Trump administration, there was a real focus, almost an immediate focus on repealing and replacing Obamacare. And I think that really hamstrung them in a lot of ways where they got bogged down in sort of this legislative squabbles. I think that really impacted their ability to be effective across the board in terms of policy. And so I think with Trump 2.0, again, the flurry of activity on executive orders has really put their put them on the front foot. And so I think that's more of a tactical approach. And then I think too, with this 10 for 1 and this, I think significant slowdown in the regulatory space, you've also seen FDA Commissioner McCary, I think, be, almost hit his stride really with using, we used to call it podium policy, but really podcast policy. I think that's something that is certainly a bit newer. It really kind of, I think, adds a layer of using newish media above and beyond what we saw with Dr. Califf and with Dr. Gottlieb, where they were very avid users of Twitter. But so this is yet another layer. I think another novel approach is his CEO roundtable, this notion of a nationwide tour, if you will, that the commissioner will endeavor. I think so. Again, this notion of how they're approaching the socialization of their policy proposals is unique. Again, with this notion of 10 for 1 being in place, and so in those venues, he's been able to, I think, and we just saw some additional publication yesterday in JAMA where he's articulating this notion of a conditional approval process. We're looking at really streamlining regulatory processes. He really has mentioned several times now this notion of cutting down the idea of a 10-year development cycle for new medicines. And so I think with that, and also the use of AI, I think with last week's announcement of ELSA, I think that's something that's also been a clear priority for him. And so I think, again, just being able to navigate in this very, slow regulatory space, they're really teeing up some key issues for what comes next. And again, this potential clearance of, withdrawing regulations based on the deregulation initiatives, they really could have, I think, some wide margins for operating there.
So we do have quite a few industry representatives in our audience. I'd love maybe from you, John and Kayla, what should industry be looking for with these shifting priorities?
I think one of the key things to think about is to manage expectations internally within the company. So we talked a little bit about this, and John touched a little bit on this. There may be more limited engagements with FDA. There may be, more written responses as opposed to actual meetings. And so to make the most of when you do have an interaction with the agency, be very much on point, manage expectations with your leadership that it may not be quite as dialogue-y or back and forth as it used to be.
So we need to make every word count.
Every word. And as John said, educate the team, know who your project manager is and educate the team on past interactions because they may not have that history.
Right.
And then, tying this back to some of the policy priorities, I think it's just going to be important to look at that MAHA Commission report, and then to the extent that your development program or your
Aligns with it.
align with that.
Absolutely.
Make that a point to highlight in your interactions with the agents.
Great advice. Great advice.
Yeah. So just dovetailing on that, it's something but Wendy and Brian said is very important, which is in 1997. I am the old guy in the panel. I was at a meeting a few weeks ago with ex-HHS officials, both Republican and Democrat. And I was always used to being the young guy, and someone pointed out, but you're the old guy now. So keeping with that theme, in 1997, when I was Commissioner's Office, there was the passage of the Food and Drug Modernization Act. And in that act, it codified good guidance practices. And what that was meant to do was ensure that the agency used a disciplined process for articulating new policy and not engage in what Brian was describing earlier, which is called podium policy, i.e. the agency would decide the policy and talk about it one speech one week, and then the next week it would be something else. This has really happened. So at industry's urging, Congress put in these provisions and there is requirements. And so in talking to clients and stakeholders, one of the things that's going to be important is there might be guidances that you want or need, and you're going to have to ask the agency to provide them. Accelerating approvals is an important, laudable goal, but I've been involved in those efforts for 20 some odd years, and I can tell you one of the keys to being able to achieve that goal has been the issuance of guidances that help provide companies
And recommendations
with companies with the tools they need so they feel comfortable going forward and developing and trying to commercialize. And so one of my concerns is that to the extent that we are moving away from guidances, that can actually have a deleterious impact on the goal we're trying to achieve. And so what I'm telling clients is keep an eye on that and remind your congressman, whomever, that we like guidances. I know working at Abbott and Bio, I worked across many different government agencies, and in some of those agencies, guidances are really bad, or they're not necessarily furthering an important, in my humble estimation, a goal as important as bringing new medicines. And so I think it's important to focus on the value of guidances and remind people as part of this larger milieu that guidances were something that industry viewed as valuable, and that it's still going to be valuable, not only in the context of accelerating new therapies, but also in terms of modernizing manufacturing. One of the executive orders that has been talked about a lot is meant to try and bring more domestic manufacturing back to the United States. And there have been companies that have pledged to do so. But it also is more likely or not that when companies bring this manufacturing back to the United States, they're going to look to use advanced therapies and other tools that, again, are easier to adopt if the agency provides adequate guidance as to how to do so. And the agency is trying to do so. I think the agency has done a really good job. They have the accelerated technology designation. There's other tools that they're trying to provide to help modernize manufacturing. So again, both in the review and the quality and compliance space, keeping an eye on the providing information that helps us meet these goals is going to be important and should be uppermost in our mind.
Couple quick things. Go ahead.
I was going to say, following up on what John was saying about guidances, a couple things. One is they've issued a lot of product-specific guidances for generic drugs. So those are still coming out, which I think is a good sign that at least they can get those through the process. But something John said about guidance is prompted me to think about, this big push for AI, and the commissioner has, talked a lot about ELSA, the AI tool, and the review that they did about a month ago that used AI. I think there's still a lot of room to shape the FDA's AI policy. I think ELSA is out there. I think ELSA is in a very infant stage. So to the extent that companies think about, AI is clearly going to be used during review processes and likely to risk prioritize inspections and in other capacities. And so I think that industry should really be thinking proactively about how they want AI to be used, and then communicate that to the agency, and sort of get on board early so that it doesn't, Latrine doesn't get out of the station without industry on board.
Brian, you want to have the last word on this
I was going to say, I usually give Kayla the last word, and that's the way we operate around here. But I would say just one thing that it really combines two thoughts there, which is what we've been able to do is help our clients understand how to really play in this gray area where there could be a lack of guidance, or and also the flip side is also true. If they have these ideas, we can certainly help get those ideas in front of the agency.
The other thing we can do is, companies can ask for guidances, and in fact, they can draft guidances and send it into the agency. Of course, it has to sort of follow the regular review and approval processes, and that is independent and remains sort of the sacred process. But, if companies are in need of additional guidance, they can ask for it, and they can ask, the administration, they can ask the agency. And I'm totally fine with you, John, being the walking encyclopedia for us all, an historian.
So can I just follow on that one point though, Wendy, because that's so important.
Little guy one?
No. I'm pretending that's not true, even though it is. That's right.
The walking encyclopedia.
So when FDAMA was passed, that was the first instance where a huge authorizing bill was used to authorize prescription drug use fees. And so it was used as a tool by the Republican House to change FDA. But the changes were so massive in terms of scope that Wendy's right. We actually said to companies and other stakeholders, feel free to draft the guidance and send it to us. And that has been something that's been available to stakeholders. And just to be clear, the agency, especially in those areas where the agency's knowledge is not as fulsome,
They welcome
they welcome that, and they will pay attention and consider.
I know from personal experiences being inside the agency, having to draft and develop guidances, and even outside the agency when the industry in a particular area felt the need for additional coaching and guidance. I help draft guidances and send it back to the agency. And then, of course, it's hands off from the external folks and the internal folks, because we're actually helping them and reducing the burden on them. So policy direction is only part of the picture. As important as it is, And that brings us to our third topic for today, and that's the topic of FDA operations. And I'm looking at you. How, John, can you help us understand, how the FDA operates now day to day internally and with its interactions with industry? I mean, those are critical.
Sure.
So can you help us with that question?
I can. So, couple things. First of all, I'm going to incorporate a lot of things that Brian and Kayla already talked about. The other thing is a caveat that this all could be moot by sundown tonight. Or 2 minutes. So this is my opinion based on facts that exist at this moment in time. But from an operational standpoint, I'm actually going to cover 3 or 4 distinct areas. The first has to do with the workforce issues that Kayla and Brian. I mean, they're inextricably intertwined, right? Because at the end of the day, the biggest question I get from every audience is, well, how's the agency going to do more with less? And also the other question is, and how many people have left? I'm like, I have no idea. But
That's changing too.
right. But in regards to the first question, even though we don't know exact numbers, the premise is right. There are fewer people. That's the goal of these actions. And the actions, just to right size this discussion, are just not reductions in force, which happened at the beginning of April. Before that, there was probationary employees. Then you add attrition and those employees who just were eligible for retirement. So you have a smaller number of folks available to do the work. And so it is going to, and then on top of that, when the hiring freeze does end, if you do decide to hire someone, you're going to have to fire 4 people. And as someone who works in the government, it is hard to fire 1 person. So the idea of firing 4 to hire 1. So basically assume that there are fewer people and then view the discussion from this vantage point. I think what we all have to look at is how the administration and the agency are going to right size both their goals and their functions based on the number of people that have been available. One of the talking points that's been bandied about is that the agency increased exponentially in a 10-year period. But let me just tell you, just to put that in context, that 10-year period is a period of incredible legislative activity and change, both in the agency's functions, but its mandates. And just to be specific, in 2009, Tobacco Control Act, 2011, Food Safety and Modernization Act, changing how both setting up a tobacco center, a new one, and redoing how food is regulated. In 2012, the Food and Drug Safety and Innovation Act contains breakthrough therapies. It contains all of these tools that are available to help with globalization and increase imported products. It contained the tools that the agency used to do alternate inspections in the pandemic, which was huge. Also, that legislation authorized the generic drug user fees and biosimilar user fees. Then 2013 Pandemic Preparation Act, 2013 Drug Quality and Security Act in response to compounding and setting up the supply chain, and then 21st Century Cures in 2016, and FDA Reauthorization Act 2017. My only point is this: having been involved in decisions about how to hire, what is important is that you need to hire to be able to address the mandates that Congress has imposed upon you, the user fee agreements that are essentially a covenant with industry, and the ability to hire to address unforeseen emergencies. And so one of the big operational issues going forward is all of us watching the different factors that the agency is going to have to weigh as it articulates its mission so that we can both help and discern whether or not the right sizing in terms of resources and workforce is achieved properly. In all honesty, and a credit to FDA senior staff, is they've brought people back. So initially, clearly there was a mistake in the right sizing. Kayla mentioned product-specific guidances. Those went away for a while because they reduced the policy staff of the Office of Generic Drugs. They brought them back. They're back and our clients are happy. So from the workforce piece is such an important part of the operational discussion. I don't have, concrete numbers. I don't have concrete impacts because of those numbers. And then on top of that, there's legislation ongoing as to whether some of these actions. So all that's going to be speculative. But the one thing that's not speculative is the need to get this right and to have a disciplined approach. So that's one part of the operational piece. The other part of the operational piece is the reorganization, which by the way is not occurring. So to his credit, Dr. McCarty starts mentioning the fact that the organizational plans that were at the department level were not going to be instituted by FDA. He reinforced that at the Food and Drug Law Institute conference. But that, and people were like, oh, sigh. But that doesn't mean there won't be change. So the second thing that's important to recognize is that the huge reorganization that would have combined all the centers and we combined all the compliant functions indeed is not going forward. But there obviously are going to be changes to take advantage of efficiencies, to get rid of redundancies. And some concrete examples are the fact that human resources, external affairs, IT functions, policy functions, a lot of that direction is actually moving up to the department level. So that's a reorg of sorts, not as comprehensive, but will have a tangible impact on how the agency articulates and handles certain matters and how we respond to them. The other issue I want to talk about quickly is budget and user fees. The only part I want to reiterate is something that Kayla said, which is there's user fees that are occurring now. They're not going away. What we're all looking at is what's going to happen in regards to the next reauthorization in 2027. And the fact that user fees are in the budget is a good sign, but also it's important for our clients and all of you to know that there is a public meeting that's scheduled for the prescription drug user fee beginning of those discussions in July, and one for the generic drug user fee as well. So despite the fact that there is certainly opposition within the administration to user fees, there are also signs that it's moving forward and you should participate accordingly until you hear otherwise. Lastly, product reviews and inspection and compliance. I think as these guys eloquently noted, there's some issues and in terms of impact as a result of the workforce issues. We don't know the depth or breadth, but it's and also, quite frankly, if you're a vaccine developer and you have a vaccine that's gotten approved, the announcement regarding the advisory committee for immunization practice is a tangible, change that you're going to have to grapple with. For those of you who don't know, that CDC committee is important because even after you get a vaccine approved, you need to go to that committee in order for commercial and reimbursement reasons. And so in reviews, I think there's a stabilization. The user fees are still holding, but there are some hiccups, and we've seen that with our clients. Inspections and compliance, I want to end with that because there's been a lot of discussion about inspections going away or the resource issues leading to a deep decline in inspections. And one of our colleagues, Don Ashley, at a recent webinar, did a great job of characterizing this in the sense that there may be fewer inspections for low risk situations, but the inspection level is still going to be much higher than it was during the pandemic when there were very few inspections. So for that reason, if you're a company and you're counting on not being inspected, that's a bad bet. Instead, what the agency is clearly going to do is engage in the same risk-based planning that they have done in the past. And they will certainly do pre-approval inspections pursuant to the user fee agreements. They certainly will do for cause inspections where there's recalls and emergencies. And they will do surveillance inspections in those situations where the risk profile warrants it. So even though there's been a lot of talk, some of it probably hopeful, that inspections, you still should do audits on your own. You should still be prepared. And then the last piece of the inspection piece that I want to touch upon is the fact that, there's been discussion during the workforce actions that no reviewers or inspectors were fired. Fair enough. But there's much more to the agency's operations than just the reviewers and the inspectors. And so in the context of inspections are just one part of the larger compliance picture. And so another operational issue to look at is whether the changes to the compliance functions that occurred as part of the big 2-year comprehensive reform that Dr. Caleb instituted stay in place so that those functions are available to review the inspection results, analyze them, and trend them so that the positive quality goals that have been articulated are met. So I moved quickly, but those are some of the concrete operational things that we should all keep our eyes on when it comes to the proper function of the agency and the attainment of the policy goals that the administration is articulating.
Thanks so much, John. A lot of information to digest, but bottom line takeaways, companies need to do the right thing and be prepared.
Absolutely.
I know we have lots of questions flowing in already, so let's kind of continue. We're gonna skip this one and move to how might these changes impact, we talked a lot about the companies and the implications for them. What about patients and consumers? Brian, you want to just quickly give us a little insight into how these internal operations within the FDA will be impacting us humans, consumers, and patients?
Yeah, so I'll take it in sort of two ways. One, to directly address your question, is that I think thankfully, and again, putting the positive spin on this, is that we still see products being approved. You mentioned that inspections are occurring. I think CETA right now has around 14 or so approvals this year. So I think in that context, we still see the FDA operating in a way that we would hopefully expect. Now, how to forecast that over the next 6 months or so for the rest of the year, it's unclear. And I think what we've talked about is this notion of a lagging indicator. So approvals, meetings with sponsors, inspections, and these very important and tangible FDA activities are really lagging indicators. So what we've tried to do is really start to collect data on this and really in a comprehensive way to see what's actually changing. Is anything changing? Do we see any sort of downtrends? And so that's an effort that we've started, and we've started to share a little bit of that information with our clients. But that's something we'll certainly continue to do, because again, when you're talking about we'll just take the RIFs on April 1st, that is a sort of a cohort of work. Really we wouldn't see necessarily tangible impacts for a period of time, months at least, to see any impact. Again, potential downtrends in FDA activity. So that's some of what we're doing right now.
Can I build on that just for 1 second, Wendy?
You get 1 second.
Sure. So we've done the same trending in regards to inspection. So that's what undergirded my statements. Is that warning letters are still being issued, inspections are still being done. Inspections are still being done with a pacing that reflects that there was a backlog because of the pandemic. So we're not making it up. We're tracking it and doing trending to back our conclusions and our future.
And the stands are still shifting. So we're learning pretty much every day.
Yes.
What I want to do now, and thank you for the wealth of information that you're providing. I'm sure, our participants are finding this quite helpful. So what I'm going to do now, because the questions are rolling in, we want to spend some time on that. Let's do our best to answer as many of those. So can we plop the first question up? Our first question is, do you have a sense of the net loss of manpower? We hear about RIFs. It's hard to say what the numbers are, retiring, others leaving, others, being volunteered to leave. And we also hear about rehires, but does anyone know what the running count is? I mean, does anyone?
I'll start. I actually don't think anybody, including FDA, has a tally on the actual number.
Because it's changing every day.
It's changing every day. I've heard 3,500, I've heard 5,000, I've heard 2,000. So it could be anywhere within that range. I think the point is that it is a significant loss of manpower. But on the flip side, they have rehired, for example, all of the ORP divisions in CEDAR that were let go. They've rehired all of OGD and L&D policy, or most of it. They brought back the FOIA staff that John mentioned, so that warning letters and other public communications are getting posted. But there's still a significant loss.
I don't believe anyone knows.
Yeah, that's the bottom line. I don't think we know. The rehires, great trend in the right direction, but it still is so very disruptive. I mean, I know we hear from our colleagues at the FDA and across the other agencies within HHS how disruptive and demoralizing all of this is, but they are still trying to do the best given the circumstances.
Absolutely.
So I'd love to move to question number 2. And this participant wants to know whether our panelists believe this upheaval, I guess that's a good word, will be short term or long term. So is it going to be within the next 4 years? Is it going to be beyond the 4 years? Help us on just quickly. I'll maybe start with you, Brian, first.
So I have a crystal ball right behind me. What it says is, no, we've certainly seen, heard, and seen a lot of this as we've already articulated. But the idea here is that, we have, I think, the luxury in a lot of ways to work through clients. We can take a measured approach to some of this. And so, while we're tracking this information, we do see some of this as significant impact on the what I call kind of lagging indicators. But forecasting out over that number of years, I think is going to be challenging. I think what we're really trying to piece together is where are we today, and then as we're building that kind of that repertoire of data as we were describing it, is where are we in say a period of 3 months and then beyond. All to say that this could have there could be more significant changes. Again, I think there's a significant runway being cleared here for the administration in terms of this deregulation initiative, that they will be able to really then very potentially quickly implement their regulatory agenda starting this fall. And honestly, they could start tomorrow with the stroke of a pen. They could take away the 10 for 1, and we, ostensibly the FDA would be back online, if you will. So I think there's a few pieces to keep in mind. When we hear terms like, very charged terms like upheaval, I think we're really looking at a snapshot in time. And so if you look over the course of a 4-year administration versus a 5-month kind of beginning, I think we might have a different perspective as we get further away from this significant and again, very significant changes at the FDA in terms of RIFs in the budget.
I think it's going to depend on the issue. I mentioned bringing manufacturing back to the United States. That's going to be a longer transformative timeline just because bringing, whether it's a tech transfer or building a new plant anew takes several years. So some of this is going to depend on what issue is being dealt with, the timeline and how transformative it is.
Just to add on to that, I do think, Brian brought up his crystal ball. I can bring up my magic 8-ball.
Better.
But what we are seeing is I mentioned earlier on, more stabilized leadership, but, there's political leadership, but there's also the career leadership that's being put in place. And that is, longer term. And I think some of those folks are sort of aligned with the MAHA agenda. So that is likely to probably carry on if they stay. So I think that's something to think about. And then to just piggyback on the deregulatory initiative that we've been talking about too, I think a key part of that is that in one of these executive orders, it made clear that notice and comment rulemaking was really not part of their operations going forward. And so that makes it quite easy, as Brian just said, to take a stroke of the pen to kind of just eliminate regulations without public comment. And that may be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on which regulations they do and how they do it. But it does certainly make it easier, and that can have very lasting implications.
Great points. So I'm going to move to our third question, and I'll start off with you, John, because this is about inspection. So one of the questions was, can you comment on FDA's announcement to expand unannounced foreign inspections and discuss some of the complexities that the industry will be facing?
Yes, I can.
And I'm going to limit the time because I know you can talk on.
Yeah, I'm going to keep this short. Yeah, I am familiar with it. So the reason this issue has come up is because prior to the passage of VDAJA in 2012, one of the big issues was how do the agency ensure inspection parity between domestic firms and overseas firms? And that was difficult, not because the inspection standard is different overseas versus the United States. It's exactly the same. The difference is, what tools do you have available to enforce that kind of good conduct overseas versus domestically? And so what happened is that when we did foreign inspections, they could not be unannounced previously because you had to get a visa. You had to go to the State Department. We would put people on planes, and then the company sometimes would say, we don't want to be inspected, and we'd have to bring people home. Or they'd get on the ground, and you'd have to bring them home. What happened with the passage of VDAJA is that two things. One is that coincided with the agency setting up foreign offices, specifically in India and China. And what we did is we staffed those offices with investigators who then could go to these plants without having to travel from the United States. And so that led to an increase of unannounced inspections, as well, coupled with additional tools that we could use to deal with violent conduct of those firms. And so, but then at some point, the unannounced inspections went away for some of these overseas facilities, and they went back to instead of being unannounced, they became unannounced inspections in India and China. And so what is being asked is to go back to the model where more of these inspections are unannounced, just like they are in the United States. And so that is what is being talked about. It was talked about in the context of the executive order in terms of, and it's also being talked about right now in a hearing in front of the, and so it's not a new concept. It's one I actually think is a good thing to do. And for companies overseas, you need to know that this is a tool that the agency can use. And you need to, as a result, this goes back to Kayla's point, my point about being vigilant. But it's not a panacea. So it should be a tool that's used along with other tools to ensure that the requisite quality is present in the products that FDA is regulating.
Yeah, good.
Is that short?
That's short enough.
Okay.
We have lots more questions. I know there's one on PRV. I'd like to give an opportunity to plug that in to perhaps make a strong suggestion that in our podcast, maybe the next one, that we discuss, the issues around PRV and how those might be changing. So I'm going to put a plug in for that. The other thing that I want to mention is that despite all of these changes and all of the uncertainties, and I'd love to hear maybe one sentence from each of you, the requirements and the bar for safety and efficacy and the integrity of inspections are not changing. The FDA still has a mandate to be that safeguard for the American public. And so with everything going on, that is an unshakable mandate. Do you agree? And whether you call it FDASIA or FDAJ, if you can just make one sentence each about, because companies are wondering, are all these changes going to impact the rigor that the FDA uses to evaluate the safety and efficacy of all the products under its jurisdiction? Because that opens up potential harm for our population. So maybe start with you, Brian.
Yeah. So I think just quickly, I think, over time, and we can go back to maybe 2004, where you see a sort of the pendulum swing in more of a safety direction. And then beyond that, you see really a bigger focus on innovation, where you mentioned breakthrough therapy was a key designation program that was implemented. So this notion of the pendulum swinging in a specific direction, I think right now, what we're really trying to understand is, as Dr. McCary is socializing some of his ideas about regulatory process, streamlining those regulatory processes, cutting development times, we really need to understand what are the tangible elements to do that. And so I think from certainly a policy perspective, that's what I'm most interested in now.
Thank you.
I do not think that the gold standard of FDA, based on science, Brian mentioned this pendulum, swings from safety to innovation, depending on the time frame and the administration and things like that. But I don't think that
the criteria
have changed.
Yeah.
And I hope that they do not change. And I think it's up to industry in some respects to actually maintain that standard and to submit, really high quality NDAs, to be prepared for inspections and follow GMPs and to really build the line there.
Excellent advice.
I agree 100%. These are statutorily mandated, right? So really, to me, the challenge for industry, and I went through this when I was at Abbott, because this is in the midst of the drugs, is the tools that are used to demonstrate safety and efficacy are what are evolving, science and tools. So if I'm industry, I'm looking for new ways to demonstrate that standard is being met, which is different
But lowering the bar.
lowering the side.
There's no lowering of the bar, that's official. So I want to thank everyone. I know we're getting close to our time. I encourage, our participants, if you have additional questions, to please reach out to, any member of our team at Eloquent for additional guidance. And that really brings us to the end of our very energetic discussions today. A big thank you to our panelists. Thank you so much for sharing your insights on this evolving landscape. We've covered a lot, I know, and there's much more, and it's changing on a daily basis. So it is clear to me that staying informed is the key. Our team here at Eloquent represents, over my last calculation, almost 400 years of experience across many centers and divisions at the FDA. And I know I can speak on behalf of all of us and on behalf of Eloquent when I say that we stand ready to serve our clients. We are committed to helping you navigate these uncertainties and these unprecedented changes across the life sciences and healthcare ecosystem, and we are happy to continue this conversation. My hope is that we can continue having the podcast, which I know are very popular, and maybe I'll suggest quarterly we could do a session like this. As a reminder to our audience, today's webinar will be posted on Eloquent's website. And my final ask to you, the audience, is to please share feedback on today's discussions, letting us know what topics, whether they were the ones we covered today were helpful. And in addition to that, what future topics you might want us to consider, including PRVs and, tropical diseases and all the other millions of things we didn't cover. So we're going to prioritize that for the next one. I want to thank you all for joining us. And again, thank you to my fellow panelists.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.